The room was tense long before the first words were spoken. It wasn't just another congressional hearing. It wasn't routine political theater. What unfolded that day felt heavier, like something structural in the American system was being tested in real time. Representative Derek Tran leaned forward, not as a politician, but as a veteran who understood what military service actually costs. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. He had facts. He had numbers. He had lived experience. And he had a question that shook the foundation of the room. Why are combat-ready troops being pulled from real national security threats to manage a domestic political moment? The number landed like a punch. $134 million. That's what this deployment was projected to cost American taxpayers. Not for a war, not for a foreign crisis, but for a domestic protest response in California. 700 active duty Marines, 4,000 National Guard troops, families disrupted, missions paused, global priorities delayed, and according to Tran, no clear constitutional or strategic justification. This wasn't just about logistics. This was about power and how it was being used. He didn't accuse at first. He asked, would a member of Congress be forcibly removed simply for attending your press event? It sounded simple, but it wasn't. That question wasn't about a press room. It was about authority, boundaries, the culture of control. Secretary Pete Hegseth's answer didn't land. It floated, deflected, avoided, and in that moment, the room felt the shift. Because when leaders dodge clear lines, systems start to weaken. Then came the real test. Tran asked a question every constitutional democracy depends on being answered clearly. Will the military follow a president's order if that order violates the Constitution? There's only one acceptable answer to that question in a democracy. No, but that word never came. Instead, the premise was rejected. Deflection replaced clarity, and silence replaced certainty. That silence mattered, because constitutional lines only work if the people in power believe in them. Then the subject shifted, but only deeper into danger. The deployment. Why Marines? Why Los Angeles? Why now? Tran laid it out. These were troops trained for real global threats. The Indo-Pacific NATO coordination Central Command regions. China expanding. Russia pushing boundaries. Middle East tensions escalating. And yet those forces were being redirected. Not to a war zone, but to a 1 square mile area in Los Angeles. A curfew zone. Tran didn't dramatize it. He quantified it. L.A. County is over 4,700 square miles. The restricted zone, 1. And for that, 700 Marines. For 1,000 Guardsmen. It didn't match. It didn't add up. Then came the procedural fracture. Did local law enforcement ask for help? No answer. Did the LAPD request this? No. Did the county sheriff request this? No. Did the governor request this? No. Instead, accusations of obstruction, of grandstanding, but no documentation of formal requests. In military operations, that matters a lot. You don't send troops without civilian coordination, not in a democracy, not under constitutional law, not in a professional military structure. And yet it happened. To Tran, this wasn't just mismanagement. It was a violation of principle. It was a shift from national defense to political optics. And the cost wasn't just money. It was morale. Families disrupted overnight. Troops pulled from meaningful missions. Lives put on pause. All for something that appeared, from the outside, like theater. As a veteran, Tran felt it personally. That's what changed the tone of his closing. This wasn't partisan. This wasn't political. It was personal. Service members weren't pieces. They weren't props. They weren't stage dressing. They were people, with families, with missions, with sacrifices that deserved respect. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply said what many veterans think, but few say publicly. This is a disgrace. And with that, he yielded his time. But what lingered in the room wasn't noise. It was silence. And in that silence was the real question. If the military becomes a political tool, who protects the Constitution when no one wants to say no? The exchange didn't fade when the microphones went silent. In fact, the real tension began after the sound bites ended. What people saw on television was only a fraction of what was actually happening. Inside the room, the air felt heavier, like something fragile had cracked, and no one was willing to admit it out loud. This was not just a disagreement between a lawmaker and a nominee. It was a warning signal about how power was beginning to shift behind the curtains of the American defense system. What made this moment so dangerous wasn't the shouting or the theatrics. It was a quiet avoidance. When leaders refuse to give clear answers on constitutional limits, it creates space for dangerous interpretations. Democracies don't collapse overnight. They weaken slowly through moments like these, where ambiguity replaces principle. Tran wasn't asking for political loyalty tests. He was asking for clarity on the very foundation of military obedience, the Constitution itself. The fact that this clarity never came was more alarming than any aggressive answer would have been. The Pentagon has always walked a delicate line. It must remain powerful enough to defend the nation, but restrained enough to never become a political weapon. That balance only works when leaders treat constitutional limits as sacred. In this exchange, that reverence felt absent. Hegseth's reluctance to give clean, direct answers suggested something deeper than miscommunication. It suggested a mindset where optics matter more than doctrine, and loyalty to political leadership risked overshadowing loyalty to the rule of law. The larger issue wasn't simply about Marines standing in Los Angeles. It was about normalizing military presence in domestic politics. Once that door opens, it rarely closes easily. History is filled with examples from other nations where military forces slowly shifted from national defense to internal political enforcement. Those shifts didn't begin with tanks in the streets. They began with small justifications, temporary deployments, and language that framed dissent as threat. Tran understood this history, even if he didn't name it directly. His insistence on coordination with local authorities wasn't bureaucracy, it was protection. In a healthy system, civilian leaders request help, the military responds, and everyone understands their boundaries. Skipping that process isn't efficiency, it's erosion. Every time that chain of accountability is ignored, it weakens the invisible guardrails that hold democratic systems together. Behind the public exchange, there's always a quieter truth. Service members are rarely asked whether they agree with the mission. They are told where to go. They obey. That trust only works when the missions are legitimate, lawful, and strategically sound. When troops are used for symbolism instead of necessity, the damage isn't visible immediately, but it builds inside the ranks. Morale doesn't collapse overnight either. It cracks slowly, one questionable order at a time. What Tran was really pointing at, without saying it directly, was a shift in philosophy. A military that is supposed to be apolitical was starting to look like a tool of narrative management. Protecting buildings is one thing. Performing power for public consumption is another. The hearing accidentally revealed that the line between those two roles had started to blur. And once that blur becomes normal, it becomes dangerous. The public watching this exchange may not have understood all the operational details, but they felt something was off. People recognize deflection. They recognize when leaders avoid saying simple truths. The discomfort wasn't partisan. It wasn't ideological. It was instinctual. When those entrusted with power can't clearly explain their limits, trust begins to evaporate. This is how institutions begin to lose legitimacy, not through dramatic collapses, but through quiet compromises. Each unanswered question becomes a crack. Each vague response becomes a fracture. Each deployment without clear justification becomes precedent. Tran wasn't just challenging one secretary. He was trying to stop a pattern before it hardened into normal practice. By the end of the segment, one thing was clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't about Los Angeles alone. It was about what kind of country emerges when military power becomes a communication strategy rather than a last resort. And once a nation crosses that line, returning becomes almost impossible. The deeper story behind this exchange wasn't written in the hearing room. It was written in the long history of how democracies slowly test their own limits. Every system built on laws and institutions eventually faces moments where leaders are tempted to stretch boundaries in the name of urgency, security, or optics. What made this moment feel different was how casually those boundaries seemed to be treated, not as guardrails, but as inconveniences. What happened in that room reflected a larger cultural shift in how power was being justified. Instead of explaining necessity, the language shifted toward dismissing dissent. Questions became hypotheticals. Accountability became speculation. Demands for clarity became framed as obstruction. This wasn't just political strategy. It was reframing the very idea of oversight as hostility. When oversight is treated as annoyance rather than duty, the system loses its balance. Military institutions rely heavily on trust, not just public trust, but internal trust. Soldiers trust that orders are legal. Commanders trust that missions make sense. Families trust that the sacrifices being made are for real threats. When that trust starts to weaken, it doesn't explode. It leaks. Slowly. Quietly. In moments like this, where troops are discussed as assets instead of people, where deployments are justified with language instead of strategy. The hearing made visible something that usually stays hidden: the tension between political loyalty and constitutional duty. Leaders are supposed to serve both, but when conflict arises, the Constitution must always win. That is the theory. The problem is that theory only works when leaders have the courage to say it out loud. When they hesitate, when they dodge, when they refuse to draw hard lines, they send a message not just to lawmakers, but to every officer and service member watching. Behind all of this was another uncomfortable question that nobody wanted to ask directly. Who decides what a threat really is? Is it an objective assessment made through intelligence, coordination, and law? Or is it something shaped by political needs, media cycles, and public image? The blurring of that distinction is one of the most dangerous developments in any modern state. Once security decisions start serving narratives, the mission becomes distorted. The public side of this exchange felt chaotic, but inside the system it was deeply ordered, and that made it more dangerous. Because when confusion exists at the top, lower levels don't stop functioning. They keep moving, following structure, following orders, assuming that someone above them knows what they're doing. That assumption is sacred in military life. When it is betrayed, the fallout doesn't show up instantly, but scars deeply. There's also a moral injury that happens in moments like this. It isn't just about legality. It's about identity. Service members don't see themselves as tools for political messaging. They see themselves as defenders of a nation, of the Constitution, of values bigger than any single administration. When their role starts to drift, when their presence is used to send political signals rather than respond to genuine danger, something inside that identity breaks. What Tran was doing in this moment wasn't simply criticizing policy. He was trying to force the system to remember itself, to remember what the military is supposed to be, to remember what civilian oversight is supposed to mean, to remember that power is not proven by how loudly it can be displayed, but by how carefully it is restrained. By this point in the story, the exchange had moved beyond personalities. It wasn't about Tran or Hegseth anymore. It was about a system being tested in real time. And the frightening truth was this: the system didn't collapse. It bent. It absorbed the pressure. And that, in some ways, was more troubling than a dramatic failure, because what bends today becomes normalized tomorrow. By the time this moment ended, something had shifted quietly in the background. No alarm sounded. No headlines fully captured it. But for anyone who understands how institutions work, the warning signs were unmistakable. When systems meant to protect democracy begin adapting themselves around political pressure instead of resisting it, the danger isn't immediate collapse. It's gradual transformation. The military doesn't need to become authoritarian overnight. It only needs to become comfortable being used. One of the most unsettling aspects of the exchange was how normal everything looked on the surface. Men in suits, formal language, parliamentary structure. But beneath that professionalism was a slow drift away from foundational discipline. The calm tone didn't make it safer. It made it more convincing. That's what makes these moments historically important. Democracies don't fall because someone announces it. They weaken because everyone adapts quietly. What made this especially dangerous was the precedent being set. Once troops are deployed domestically without clear coordination or transparent requests, that act becomes easier to repeat. The second time feels less dramatic. The third time feels routine. Eventually, the presence of military hardware and uniforms in civil spaces no longer shocks the public. And when it no longer shocks, it no longer restrains leaders. Power thrives on normalization. The relationship between civilian leadership and the military is built on mutual respect and clearly defined roles. When political leaders begin treating the armed forces as a flexible instrument of optics, the relationship warps. It shifts from service to spectacle, from defense to display. That shift doesn't just affect the public perception, it reshapes internal culture. Leaders who should be trained in restraint start valuing visibility. Another silent consequence of moments like these is what happens in the minds of young officers and enlisted members. They are watching. They are learning, not from speeches, but from patterns. When they see deployments justified vaguely, oversight minimized, and constitutional questions brushed aside, they learn a dangerous lesson. That power flows more from alignment than accountability. That lesson can live inside a force for decades. What makes this even more concerning is how easily these dynamics can be reversed under the language of security. Security is a powerful word. It justifies speed. It excuses bypassing process. It discourages dissent. Once everything becomes a security issue, any question feels like sabotage. That is not how healthy defense institutions operate. Healthy institutions encourage questions because questions expose weakness before it becomes disaster. Tran's role in this story became symbolic of something much larger. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He wasn't trying to win a headline. He was forcing the system to look at itself in the mirror. And what it saw wasn't a crisis of violence. It was a crisis of clarity, a crisis of purpose, a crisis of memory, forgetting what these institutions were built to prevent. There is also a psychological dimension that rarely gets discussed publicly. When troops are repeatedly placed in morally ambiguous situations, it hardens them, not in strength, but in numbness. They stop asking why. They stop caring about context. They focus only on execution. That is incredibly dangerous in a democracy because a force trained to act without reflection becomes vulnerable to manipulation. By this stage of the story, the real conflict wasn't between individuals. It was between two visions of power. One view sees military power as something sacred, restrained, and used only as a last resort. The other sees it as something flexible, useful, and available whenever optics demand strength. The exchange in that room exposed which direction parts of the system were starting to lean. And the most dangerous part of all? None of this requires bad intentions. Systems don't decay only because of villains. They decay because of normalization, convenience, speed, silence. And that silence, in that room in those moments, was louder than any argument. By this point, what looked like a heated political hearing had quietly transformed into a much deeper examination of institutional character. Moments like these don't feel historic when they happen. They feel procedural, routine, technical. But history is built from exactly these moments, when the rules are bent just enough that the bend starts to feel like the new shape. One of the most troubling elements wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. There was no firm commitment to constitutional guardrails, no clear articulation of red lines, no visible discomfort with the idea of domestic military normalization. Silence filled the gaps where democratic instincts should have lived. And in political systems, silence is never neutral, always leans in the direction of power. The language used during the exchange also mattered. Words like coordination and support replaced more honest terms like authorization and requests. This shift isn't semantic. It's structural. When leadership replaces formal legal frameworks with soft, flexible language, they create space where decisions can be made without accountability. It becomes easier to justify extraordinary actions as routine management. The human element remained buried beneath the strategic talk, but it was always present. Thousands of real people, not numbers, not units, not assets, were being moved around like chess pieces. Families had plans disrupted. Children had parents suddenly absent. Careers were put on pause. These aren't abstract consequences. These are the real prices paid when military lives are treated as tools of convenience instead of instruments of necessity. What makes this especially dangerous is how efficiently the system can operate even when misaligned. Orders can be executed flawlessly even if the mission is flawed. Logistics can be perfect even if the purpose is wrong. That's the paradox of professional militaries. They are designed to be effective, not to question motives. Oversight is supposed to come from civilian leadership. When civilian leadership fails, the system still functions, but in a distorted direction. Another quiet shift revealed in this moment was the erosion of shared reality. When officials began dismissing reported facts as context missing or speculative, it undermined the very idea of objective truth in governance. Democracies depend on shared facts. Once those facts become negotiable, accountability collapses. You cannot hold power accountable if power is allowed to redefine reality. There was also a subtle but powerful message sent to future leaders. Watch what happens when you deflect. Watch how avoidance protects you. Watch how ambiguity keeps doors open. These are lessons learned not through training manuals, but through watching real consequences or the lack of consequences unfold in real time. That kind of institutional learning is extremely difficult to reverse. Trans frustration wasn't theatrical. It was cumulative. It was the weight of watching an institution drift from its own ideals while pretending everything was normal. That kind of frustration doesn't explode. It hardens. It becomes warning. And warnings are only useful if someone is willing to listen. In that room, it didn't feel like anyone was. The most unsettling realization by this stage was that no single decision felt catastrophic. No single answer felt outrageous enough to trigger alarms. That is the danger. Systems rarely collapse through dramatic failure. They erode through acceptable compromises that pile up over time until the original structure no longer exists. And as this part of the story closes, the real question isn't what happened in Los Angeles or who won the verbal exchange. The real question is this: how many times can a system quietly bend before it forgets that it was never meant to bend at all? By now, the implications had moved far beyond a single hearing or a single decision. What was unfolding was a slow cultural adjustment inside power itself. When institutions begin to internalize the idea that extraordinary actions are normal, they don't just change rules, they change mindset. And mindset, once altered, is far harder to correct than policy. A dangerous comfort had started to appear in the way authority was described. Power was no longer framed as something that needed constant restraint. It was framed as something that simply needed better messaging. That shift is subtle, but deadly. When the focus moves from "should we do this" to "how do we justify this?", the moral core of leadership begins to hollow out. The military's role in a democracy is built around distance from politics. It is supposed to exist as a shield, not a stage prop. But what this moment revealed was a growing willingness to blur that distance when politically convenient. The danger here isn't just theoretical. It is structural. Once the military becomes visually associated with political control, it becomes psychologically associated with political authority in the public mind. Inside the ranks, this creates a quiet conflict. Soldiers are taught loyalty, discipline, and obedience, but they are also taught constitutional values. When missions start to look like political theater instead of national defense, the internal conflict doesn't disappear. It gets buried. And buried conflict doesn't go away. It festers. Over time, it turns into disillusionment, cynicism, or worse, blind compliance without internal moral grounding. Another layer of this problem lies in how quickly temporary measures become permanent habits. Every exception sets the groundwork for the next. Every emergency becomes a template. Every deployment justified by urgency creates a shortcut that will be used again. This is how extraordinary power becomes ordinary, not through tyranny, but through repetition. What made this particular moment so revealing was how casually massive force redirection was discussed. Thousands of service members, millions of dollars, global mission impact, all framed as operational adjustments rather than seismic decisions. That casualness is not efficiency. It is desensitization. When power stops feeling heavy, it becomes dangerous. The public, watching from the outside, rarely sees these shifts in real time. They see fragments, a clip, a headline, a viral moment. They don't see the institutional body language, the avoidance patterns, the normalization of ambiguity. But those internal movements matter far more than public outrage cycles. Systems don't respond to anger. They respond to structure. And structure was quietly changing. Tran's role in this phase of the story feels almost like that of a historical witness, rather than a political actor. He wasn't inventing a problem. He was naming it. He was giving language to something that had been happening quietly for years. That's often how real warnings sound. Not dramatic, but deeply uncomfortable. Not loud, but impossible to ignore once you understand them. What makes moments like this especially dangerous is that they don't feel like disasters. They feel like adjustments, optimizations, necessary evolutions. That's the lie. Democracies are not supposed to evolve toward concentrated power. They're supposed to evolve toward stronger restraint. When the opposite happens, the system may survive, but it becomes something else. By this point in the narrative, the military had not turned against the Constitution. Nothing that dramatic had happened, and that's precisely the danger. The system was shifting without breaking. It was adapting in ways that would only become visible in hindsight. And when hindsight arrives, it is usually too late to undo what has already been normalized. The story at this stage was no longer about a political argument. It was about a quiet transformation. And quiet transformations in history are the ones that last the longest and are the hardest to reverse. By the time the system reaches this stage, the most dangerous part is not misuse of power. It is familiarity with it. Power that once felt heavy now feels routine. Decisions that once required hesitation now slide forward with quiet confidence. This isn't the sound of collapse. It's the sound of adaptation. And adaptation, in the wrong direction, is how democracies slowly lose their shape without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. One of the clearest shifts revealed through this unfolding story was how accountability started feeling optional rather than essential. Oversight wasn't rejected outright. It was tolerated, delayed, softened, redirected. Those techniques are far more effective than confrontation because they preserve appearance while weakening substance. It allows systems to claim transparency while avoiding real exposure. The military, by its nature, is structured around trust. Orders flow downward. Loyalty flows upward. That balance only works when the center of gravity remains the Constitution. But when the center begins to drift toward political survival and narrative control, everything subtly reorients. Loyalty begins to orbit around power instead of principle. That change doesn't happen through command. It happens through culture. Another quiet danger was the way uncertainty became strategy. Vague answers were no longer seen as weakness. They became tools. They allowed flexibility. They avoided hard commitments. In the short term, that seemed smart. In the long term, it erodes a moral contract between leadership and the people. Democracies require clear commitments. Ambiguity is not neutrality. It is power without boundaries. Inside government institutions, younger leaders learn more from behavior than from doctrine. What they witnessed here was not defiance of the Constitution, but something arguably more corrosive. Comfort in avoiding it. Silence became safer than truth. Alignment became safer than integrity. And when that lesson becomes embedded, it stays long after individual leaders are gone. What also became clear is that systems like this don't break because of one man or one decision. They shift because pressure is rewarded and resistance is ignored. When those who push against drift feel isolated and those who comply feel secure, the system naturally tilts. That's not conspiracy. That's organizational gravity. The broader public, disconnected from these internal shifts, often only sees the surface conflict, the viral moments, the sharp exchanges, the political framing. But real power doesn't live in sound bites. It lives in process. It lives in what becomes normal. And what was becoming normal here was the idea that the military could be a first response to political tension rather than a last resort to real national threat. Tran's presence in this story began to feel less like opposition and more like resistance memory. He represented the version of the system that remembered what it was built to prevent, not conquest, not intimidation, not domestic dominance, but defense, restraint, balance. Without voices like that, systems don't just drift, they forget. By this stage, the exchange had become symbolic of something much larger than one deployment or one budget dispute. It represented a civilization-level choice between fear-driven control and principle-driven restraint. And the terrifying truth is that civilizations rarely recognize those crossroads in real time. They only name them after the path has already been chosen. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. That's the haunting part. Everything kept moving smoothly. Meetings continued. Orders flowed. Systems worked. And that's why it was dangerous. Because when power shifts quietly, it doesn't look like danger. It looks like efficiency. The story now wasn't about what might happen. It was about what was already happening. Slowly, invisibly, structurally. And by the time people feel it, it's usually already embedded too deeply to remove easily. By the time this story reaches its final stage, the most unsettling truth is not what changed, but how quietly it changed. No dramatic takeover. No sudden declaration. No moment where everyone stood up and said, "This is a turning point." Instead, power simply settled into new habits. It learned what it could do without resistance. And then it did it again. What happened in that hearing room was never just about one deployment, one secretary, or one exchange. It was about a system revealing how comfortable it had become with flexibility in places where rigidity was once considered sacred. Constitutional limits, once spoken with reverence, were treated like abstract concepts. Military restraint, once seen as essential, was reframed as optional depending on the political moment. The most dangerous shift was psychological, not structural. People began to accept what they once would have questioned. Military presence in civil spaces no longer felt shocking. Avoidance of direct constitutional answers no longer felt alarming. Silence where clarity once lived started feeling normal. And when society becomes comfortable with that kind of normalization, the groundwork for long-term erosion is already laid. History rarely marks these moments with fireworks. It marks them with footnotes that later become chapters. Scholars eventually point to hearings like this and say, this is where the language changed. This is where the expectations shifted. This is where power stopped fearing oversight. Those realizations always come after the fact, never during. What makes this especially painful is that none of this requires evil intent. Systems don't drift because everyone becomes malicious. They drift because convenience replaces courage. Speed replaces reflection. Optics replace principles. The people inside the system often believe they are protecting stability. In reality, they are often reshaping it in ways they don't fully understand. Tran's final tone in this story wasn't rage. It was grief. Grief for an institution he served. Grief for a structure that once felt solid. Grief for a set of unwritten rules that were quietly being ignored. That kind of grief doesn't scream. It settles. It lingers. It stays long after the cameras are turned off. The truth is, systems can survive a long time in this state. They don't collapse immediately. They function. They adapt. They even become more efficient on the surface. But the cost is invisible until it isn't. And when it becomes visible, the repair is no longer easy. This final segment is not a prediction of disaster. It is a warning about direction, about slope, about trajectory. Democracies don't die in storms. They fade in silence. They weaken in comfort. They shrink in the absence of resistance. And what this exchange ultimately revealed is not a broken system, but a system at risk of forgetting why it exists in the first place. To defend the nation, yes, but also to defend the idea that power must always answer the law, not the other way around. In the end, the most powerful line of this entire story isn't something that was shouted, but something that was never said clearly enough, that the Constitution is not negotiable. And when that sentence becomes hard to say out loud, history tells us everything we need to know about where a system is headed.